The summer of 1988 hung thick and humid over Millfield, Pennsylvania, like a wool blanket soaked in creek water. It was the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and sent children racing toward any promise of shade or cool water. For 12-year-old Emma Hartley, that summer should have been filled with the simple pleasures that define childhood in small-town America: bicycle rides through tree-lined streets, afternoons at the community pool, and the endless stretch of days that seemed to promise forever. Instead, it became the summer that would haunt an entire community for decades to come. Emma was not the kind of child who disappeared into the background of adult conversations. She possessed that rare combination of fearless curiosity and infectious warmth that drew both children and adults into her orbit. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like spun copper, and her green eyes held the kind of mischievous intelligence that promised both trouble and delight. She was the middle child of three, sandwiched between her older brother Danny, 14, and her younger sister Claire, who had just turned 8. The Hartley children were fixtures in Millfield's tight-knit neighborhoods, where front doors remained unlocked and parents tracked their children's whereabouts through a network of watchful neighbors and the distant sound of bicycle bells. Robert Hartley worked as a foreman at the limestone quarry that provided much of Millfield's economic foundation, his hands permanently stained with dust, and his back bent from 20 years of honest labor. His wife, Patricia, taught 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary, where her gentle manner and infinite patience had guided hundreds of children through their first serious academic challenges. The Hartleys represented everything solid and dependable about small-town American life: church on Sundays, barbecues in the backyard, and children who knew they were loved unconditionally. Emma's passion was exploration. While other children were content to play in their own yards or venture no further than the neighborhood park, Emma possessed an almost magnetic attraction to the unknown corners of Millfield. She knew every shortcut, every hidden trail, and every abandoned building within a 5-mile radius of her home on Maple Street. Her bicycle, a red Schwinn Stingray with white wall tires and a banana seat that had seen better days, was her vehicle of choice for these adventures. The bike had been a Christmas present 2 years earlier, and Emma had covered every inch of its frame with colorful reflective stickers that caught the light like scattered diamonds. The morning of July 15, 1988, began like any other summer day in the Hartley household. Patricia was in the kitchen, preparing sandwiches for what she assumed would be another ordinary day of childhood adventure. The local radio station played quietly in the background, mixing classic rock with updates about the ongoing drought that had left lawns brown and tempers short. Emma bounded down the stairs at 8:30, her hair hastily pulled into a ponytail, and her clothes chosen more for comfort than fashion. Denim shorts, a faded yellow t-shirt with a cartoon unicorn, and worn sneakers that had carried her through countless adventures. "Where are you planning to explore today, Columbus?" Robert asked from behind his morning newspaper, using the nickname he'd given Emma after she'd once announced her intention to discover new lands beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood. Emma grinned, her eyes already sparkling with the promise of adventure. "Jenny and I are going to ride out to Miller's Creek. We want to see if the water level's gone down enough to find those old bottles people say are buried in the mud." Patricia looked up from her sandwich preparation, a familiar flutter of maternal concern crossing her features. "That's pretty far, honey. And you know how I feel about you two going to the creek alone." "Mom, we are not babies," Emma protested, employing the universal 12-year-old argument for increased independence. "Besides, Jenny's brother Tom said he might meet us there later, and we will be careful, I promise." Jenny Morrison was Emma's closest friend, a shy, bookish girl whose parents had moved to Millfield the previous autumn when her father took a position at the local bank. The friendship between Emma and Jenny had surprised many in the community, Emma with her bold, adventurous spirit, and Jenny with her quiet, cautious nature seemed like unlikely companions, but their bond had proven deep and genuine, each girl finding in the other something that balanced her own character. Emma encouraged Jenny to be braver, while Jenny provided the voice of reason that occasionally prevented Emma's curiosity from leading her into genuinely dangerous situations. After the usual negotiations about safety, return times, and emergency procedures. Patricia finally granted permission for the creek expedition. Emma stuffed her backpack with the provisions her mother had prepared: 2 peanut butter sandwiches, a thermos of lemonade, a bag of chips, and a first aid kit that Patricia insisted on including in any adventure that took the girls beyond walking distance of home. At 9:15, Emma wheeled her bicycle out of the garage, the reflective stickers catching the morning sun and casting tiny rainbows across the driveway. She called goodbye to her parents, promising to be home by 4 o'clock, and pedaled down Maple Street toward Jenny's house on the other side of the neighborhood. The Morrison house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, lined with mature oak trees that provided blessed shade during the hottest part of the day. Emma found Jenny waiting on the front porch, her own bicycle a more practical 10-speed in sensible blue already loaded with supplies. Jenny was methodical in her preparations, a trait that both impressed and occasionally frustrated her more spontaneous friend. She had packed extra water, a detailed hand-drawn map of their intended route, and a small notebook where she recorded observations from their various expeditions. The 2 girls set off toward Miller's Creek at 9:30, taking the familiar route that led them through the heart of Millfield's residential neighborhoods. They passed the elementary school where Patricia taught, its windows dark and playground empty during the summer break. They waved to Miss Patterson, who was watering her prize-winning roses, and called out greetings to several other neighbors who had emerged to tend their gardens in the relative cool of the morning hours. Miller's Creek lay approximately 3 miles southeast of the main residential area, accessible by a winding dirt road that had once served the now-defunct Morrison Mill. The creek itself was little more than a stream during normal conditions, but the ongoing drought had reduced it to scattered pools connected by thin trickles of water that barely covered the rocky creek bed. Local legend claimed that the creek held treasures from the mill's operational days: old bottles, tools, and perhaps even coins that had been lost or discarded over the decades. The girls made good time on the paved roads, their conversation ranging from school gossip to summer plans to their shared fascination with Nancy Drew mysteries. Emma was particularly excited about a new series of books she'd discovered at the library, stories about teenage detectives solving crimes that the police couldn't crack. She'd been inspired to start her own detective notebook, though her entries so far consisted mainly of observations about neighbors' routine activities rather than anything genuinely mysterious. As they turned onto Creek Road, the last paved thoroughfare before the dirt track leading to Miller's Creek, the character of their surroundings began to change. The well-maintained suburban homes gave way to older properties with larger lots and fewer neighbors. Ancient farmhouses sat back from the road, many of them showing signs of long neglect. Rusted mailboxes marked driveways that disappeared into overgrown woods, and more than one property bore no trespassing signs that had weathered to near illegibility. It was along this stretch of Creek Road that several witnesses would later report seeing the 2 girls pedaling steadily toward their destination with no apparent signs of distress or concern. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, hanging laundry behind her farmhouse, specifically remembered noting the time 10:15 when she heard the sound of bicycle wheels on gravel and looked up to see 2 girls riding past. She would later tell investigators that she'd felt a momentary impulse to wave, but had decided against it, not wanting to startle them if they hadn't noticed her in her yard. Thomas Brenner, a local farmer who was moving cattle from one pasture to another, also reported seeing the girls around 10:20. His property bordered Creek Road for nearly half a mile, and he watched them pedal past while he repaired a section of fence. Like Miss Kellerman, he noted nothing unusual about their appearance or behavior. They were simply 2 children on bicycles, heading toward what he assumed was a morning of innocent exploration. The dirt track to Miller's Creek branched off from Creek Road about a quarter-mile past the Brennan farm, marked only by a faded wooden sign that had once directed visitors to Morrison. The track wound through dense woodland for approximately half a mile before opening into the small clearing, where the creek widened into what locals called the Mill Pond, though the actual mill structure had been demolished decades earlier. According to Jenny's later testimony given through tears and in the fractured manner of a traumatized child, The girls reached Miller's Creek without incident sometime around 10:30. The drought had indeed lowered the water level significantly, exposing muddy banks and rocky areas that were normally underwater. Emma immediately began searching for the rumored bottles, wading into the shallow pools with her sneakers tied around her neck and her shorts rolled up to avoid getting them wet. Jenny, characteristically more cautious, remained on the bank and began sketching the creek bed in her notebook, documenting their findings with the methodical approach she brought to all their adventures. She drew detailed maps of where Emma searched and made notes about the types of rocks and debris they encountered. It was Jenny's habit to create these records of their expeditions, a practice that had initially amused Emma but which she'd grown to appreciate as their friendship deepened. For nearly an hour, the girls explored the creek bed and surrounding area. Emma discovered several interesting pieces of colored glass, not the intact bottles they'd hoped for, but fragments that might have come from the same sources. Jenny found what appeared to be an old horseshoe, its iron surface pitted with rust, but still clearly recognizable. They ate their lunch sitting on a fallen log that bridged the narrowest part of the creek, their feet dangling in the cool water while they shared sandwiches and speculated about the lives of the people who had once worked at the mill. It was during their lunch that Emma first mentioned hearing something unusual in the woods beyond the creek. Jenny would later struggle to describe exactly what Emma had reported. It wasn't quite a voice, but it wasn't simply the normal sounds of wildlife either. Emma had seemed curious rather than frightened, describing it as like someone calling, but far away and kind of muffled. Jenny, whose natural caution extended to unexplained sounds in isolated locations, suggested they finish their lunch and head home. But Emma's curiosity was piqued. She insisted on investigating the source of the sound, promising Jenny they would only take a quick look and then return to their bicycles. This was the decision that would haunt Jenny Morrison for the rest of her life. The girls left their bicycles near the creek and ventured into the woods, following what appeared to be an old deer path that wound deeper into the forest. Jenny stayed close behind Emma, growing increasingly uncomfortable as they moved further from the familiar clearing. The woods were darker here, the canopy thick enough to block most of the midday sun, and the normal sounds of birds and insects seemed muted and distant. According to Jenny's account, they walked for perhaps 10 minutes before Emma suddenly stopped and held up her hand for silence. The sound she'd heard earlier was clearer now, definitely human, though still indistinct. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of them, beyond a small ridge that rose from the forest floor. Emma insisted they investigate further, but Jenny had reached the limit of her comfort zone. The two girls argued briefly, the only real conflict of their friendship with Emma, accusing Jenny of being too scared of everything, and Jenny pleading with Emma to turn back. Finally, Emma agreed to a compromise. She would investigate the sound alone, but only if Jenny promised to wait for her at the creek. Emma would be gone no more than 15 minutes, and if she didn't return by then, Jenny should ride back to town and get help. It was approximately 12:15 when Emma disappeared into the woods alone, leaving Jenny sitting on their log bridge, watching the hands of her watch move with agonizing slowness. Jenny would later describe those 15 minutes as the longest of her life, every sound in the forest taking on sinister significance. When Emma failed to return at the promised time, Jenny called her name repeatedly, her voice growing more desperate with each unanswered shout. At 12:40, Jenny made the decision that probably saved her own life. Despite her loyalty to Emma and her reluctance to abandon her friend, she retrieved her bicycle and began the long ride back to Millfield, pedaling as fast as her trembling legs would carry her. She arrived at the Hartley house at 1:20, barely able to speak through her tears as she tried to explain to Patricia what had happened at Miller's Creek. Robert Hartley was summoned from the quarry, and by 2 o'clock, an impromptu search party had assembled in the Hartley driveway. The group included Robert and 2 of his co-workers, Jenny's father, David Morrison, and 3 neighbors who had dropped everything to help find Emma. They drove to Miller's Creek in 2 vehicles, their hearts pounding with the kind of dread that every parent knows but hopes never to experience. At Miller's Creek, they found Emma's bicycle exactly where Jenny had said it would be, standing undisturbed near the fallen log. Her backpack sat nearby, its contents scattered as if she'd been searching for something. Most disturbing of all, her sneakers, the ones she'd removed to wade in the creek, were still tied together and hanging from a low branch where she'd left them. The search party followed the deer path into the woods, calling Emma's name until their voices were hoarse. They found the ridge that Jenny had described, and beyond it a small clearing that might once have been a homestead. The foundation of an old cabin was still visible, along with the remnants of what might have been a well, but of Emma herself there was no trace. As daylight began to fade, the local sheriff was contacted, and what had begun as a neighborhood search became an official missing persons investigation. Sheriff William Kowalski, a 20-year veteran of rural law enforcement, arrived at Miller's Creek with 2 deputies and a growing sense that this case would challenge everything he thought he knew about keeping his community safe. By the evening of July 15th, search teams equipped with flashlights and portable generators had transformed the quiet woods around Miller's Creek into something resembling a disaster site. Volunteers from throughout Millfield had joined the effort, creating a human chain that methodically combed through the forest. The Pennsylvania State Police had been notified, and additional resources were being mobilized for what everyone hoped would be a brief search ending in Emma's safe return. But as the hours passed and the temperature dropped, hope began to give way to darker possibilities. Emma was an experienced outdoors enthusiast who knew the woods around Millfield better than most adults. She was also a responsible child who understood the importance of keeping promises and following safety rules. Her failure to return or respond to the searchers suggested something more sinister than a simple case of a lost child. The first 48 hours of the investigation followed predictable patterns. Jenny Morrison was interviewed extensively, her story checked and cross-checked for inconsistency. The family's background was examined, though no one who knew the Hartleys could imagine any reason why Emma might have run away. The woods around Miller's Creek were searched with increasing thoroughness, using trained dogs and eventually helicopter surveillance. On July 17th, 2 days after Emma's disappearance, the case took its first unexpected turn. A jogger named Michael Torres, running his usual morning route through Millfield Park, discovered something that would transform the investigation from a local missing person case into something far more complex and disturbing. Millfield Park sat on the opposite side of town from Miller's Creek, a well-maintained recreational area that featured walking trails, picnic tables, and a playground that served as a gathering place for families throughout the warmer months. The park's main parking lot, which had been repaved the previous spring, typically hosted cars belonging to joggers, dog walkers, and parents supervising their children's activities. At approximately 6:30 that morning, Torres was stretching against his car before beginning his run when something caught his eye. Lying on the asphalt near the edge of the parking lot was a single Polaroid photograph, its white border slightly yellowed and one corner torn as if it had been handled roughly. Torres initially assumed the photo was simply litter that had blown from an overflowing trash can, but something about it made him pause. The image, though faded and slightly overexposed, clearly showed a young girl with auburn hair, bound with what appeared to be rope or cord, sitting in what looked like the interior of a vehicle or small structure. The girl's face was turned partially away from the camera, but her profile was unmistakable. It was Emma Hartley. Torres immediately contacted the sheriff's department, and within an hour the photograph was in the hands of investigators. The image was both horrifying and puzzling, clearly showing Emma alive but in captivity, yet offering few clues about her location or her captor's identity. The photograph measured 3½ by 4¼ inches, the standard dimensions for Polaroid instant film. The backing bore no date stamps or processing information, indicating it had been taken with one of the instant cameras that had become popular throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The image quality suggested it had been taken recently, probably within the previous few days. Sheriff Kowalski called in specialists from the state crime laboratory, who began their analysis with a level of intensity rarely seen in rural Pennsylvania. Every aspect of the photograph was examined: the type of film used, the lighting conditions, any background details that might provide location clues, and even the specific model of camera that had taken the picture. The rope binding Emma appeared to be common utility cord, available at any hardware store in Pennsylvania. The background showed what looked like wooden paneling, possibly the interior of an old building or vehicle. Most disturbing of all, Emma's expression, what could be seen of it, suggested fear and confusion, though the angle of the photograph made it impossible to determine her exact condition or state of consciousness. The discovery of the photograph raised as many questions as it answered. Why had someone taken such an image? Why had they left it in a public location where it would certainly be found? Was it a taunt directed at investigators, or some form of proof of life intended for the family? And most crucially, where was Emma now? The parking lot where the photograph was discovered became a crime scene, cordoned off while investigators searched for additional evidence. They found nothing: no other photographs, no notes, no physical evidence that might lead them to the person responsible. The location itself seemed almost random, chosen perhaps for its visibility rather than any strategic importance. News of the photograph's discovery spread through Millfield like wildfire, transforming what had been a community tragedy into something far more sinister. Parents who had previously allowed their children considerable freedom now kept them within sight at all times. The carefree atmosphere of summer in small-town America evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability and fear. The investigation expanded dramatically. Federal authorities were contacted, bringing resources and expertise that the local sheriff's department couldn't provide. The photograph was analyzed using techniques that seemed like science fiction to most Millfield residents: computer enhancement, spectral analysis, and microscopic examination that could potentially reveal details invisible to the naked eye. But even as the investigation grew more sophisticated, the basic questions remained unanswered. Emma Hartley had vanished from a creek bed 3 miles from town, and her photograph had appeared in a parking lot on the opposite side of Millfield. Someone had taken her, photographed her, and then, for reasons that defied understanding, chosen to advertise their crime by leaving evidence in a public location. As the sun set on July 17, 1988, Sheriff Kowalski stood in his office, staring at the photograph that had transformed his investigation. The image of Emma, frightened, bound, but apparently alive, seemed to stare back at him with an accusation he felt powerless to answer. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, a 12-year-old girl was being held against her will by someone who had demonstrated both the callousness to kidnap her and the strange compulsion to document their crime. The photograph proved Emma was alive, at least when it was taken, but it also suggested a level of premeditation and psychological complexity that made Kowalski's blood run cold. The case of Emma Hartley's disappearance had become something far more terrifying than anyone in Millfield had imagined, and as the investigation entered its 3rd day, everyone involved understood that they were dealing with someone whose motivations and intentions remained as dark and mysterious as the woods where Emma had first vanished. The photograph in Sheriff Kowalski's hands represented both hope and horror, proof that Emma was alive, but also evidence that she was in the hands of someone whose next move was impossible to predict. In the oppressive summer heat of 1988, the town of Millfield held its breath and waited for answers that seemed as elusive as shadows in the gathering dusk. The Pennsylvania State Police Crime Laboratory in Harrisburg had analyzed thousands of pieces of evidence during its 20-year existence, but few cases had generated the level of urgency that surrounded the single Polaroid photograph delivered from Millfield on the morning of July. Detective Lieutenant Angela Reeves, a forensic specialist with 15 years of experience in criminal photography analysis, had been pulled from her current caseload to focus exclusively on what the media was already calling the Millfield Polaroid case. Reeves was a methodical investigator whose reputation had been built on her ability to extract information from images that other analysts had dismissed as worthless. She had solved cases by identifying reflection patterns in windows, by analyzing shadow angles to determine time of day, and by recognizing background details so subtle that they were nearly invisible to the untrained eye. If there were secrets hidden in the photograph of Emma Hartley, Reeves would find them. Her initial examination confirmed what Sheriff Kowalski had already suspected: the photograph had been taken with a Polaroid SX70 camera, probably within 48 hours of its discovery. The film stock was relatively fresh, suggesting the camera and supplies were readily available to whoever had taken the image. The lighting appeared to be artificial, probably from a single overhead source, and the background showed wood paneling that could have come from any number of locations: a basement, a cabin, an older mobile home, or even the interior of a large vehicle like a van or RV. But it was the details that weren't immediately obvious that began to tell a more complex story. Using high-powered magnification, Reeves discovered what appeared to be numbers or letters reflected in Emma's eyes, too small and distorted to read, but potentially significant if they represented signage or documentation visible to Emma when the photograph was taken. The binding around Emma's wrists showed a distinctive knot pattern that suggested some familiarity with ropework, possibly indicating experience in construction, sailing, or camping. Most disturbing of all, Reeves identified what appeared to be a second person, partially visible in the extreme left edge of the frame. Just the shadow of a shoulder and arm, but enough to confirm that Emma's captor had been present when the photograph was taken, and possibly that a third person had operated the camera. While Reeves worked her technical magic in Harrisburg, the investigation in Millfield had expanded into something resembling a small-scale military operation. FBI Special Agent David Walsh had arrived from the Pittsburgh field office, bringing with him resources and expertise that transformed the local sheriff's department into a temporary command center. Additional state police investigators had been assigned to the case, and a dedicated phone line had been established to handle the increasing number of tips and reported sightings that were flooding in from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Agent Walsh was a career investigator whose specialty was child abduction cases. His methods were systematic and relentless, based on the understanding that the first 72 hours of such investigations were typically crucial to the victim's survival. With Emma having been missing for 4 days, Walsh operated under the assumption that time was running out, if it hadn't already. The first major breakthrough came on July 19th, when a second Polaroid photograph was discovered. Margaret Stevens, a retired school teacher who lived alone in a small house near Millfield's main commercial district, had developed the habit of taking early morning walks through the downtown area as part of her daily routine. At approximately 6:15 that Tuesday morning, she was passing the First National Bank when something unusual caught her attention. Wedged beneath the windshield wiper of a car parked directly in front of the bank was what appeared to be a photograph. Stevens, who had been following news of Emma's disappearance with the intensity of someone who had spent 30 years caring for other people's children, immediately recognized the potential significance of her discovery. The second photograph showed Emma from a different angle, apparently taken in the same location as the first. But this image was far more disturbing than its predecessor. Emma's condition had clearly deteriorated. Her hair was disheveled, her clothing torn, and her visible skin showed what appeared to be bruises or marks. Most chilling of all, a newspaper was visible in the frame, folded to display the date, July 8. The inclusion of the newspaper was clearly intentional, designed to prove that Emma was alive as recently as the previous day. But it also suggested something else: that her captor was following news coverage of the case and was responding to the investigation in real time. Agent Walsh immediately ordered a complete analysis of the vehicle where the photograph had been found. The car belonged to Janet Morris, a bank teller, who had parked there the previous evening before attending a community meeting about neighborhood safety, a meeting that had been organized in direct response to Emma's disappearance. Morris had left the meeting at approximately 10 o'clock and had driven straight home, less than 2 miles away. She swore that nothing had been on her windshield when she'd parked the car in her garage. This meant that someone had visited the downtown area sometime between 10 o'clock Monday evening and 6:15 Tuesday morning, specifically to leave the second photograph. The downtown area was not heavily trafficked during those hours, but it wasn't completely deserted either. Several businesses maintained overnight security, and the state police began canvassing for anyone who might have seen unusual activity. The psychological profile that was emerging from the photographs was deeply troubling. Emma's captor was not simply holding her. They were actively documenting her captivity and using those images to communicate with investigators. The choice of locations for leaving the photographs seemed deliberate. Both the park and the bank were central, public locations where discovery was virtually guaranteed, but both were also places where someone could come and go without attracting significant attention. FBI behavioral analysts who reviewed the case files suggested that the perpetrator was likely someone with connections to the Millfield community, possibly someone who was following the investigation closely and deriving some form of satisfaction from the attention the case was generating. The decision to include the dated newspaper indicated planning and foresight, suggesting that more photographs might be forthcoming. As if responding to this prediction, the third photograph appeared on July. This time the image was discovered by Father Michael O'Brien, the pastor of St. Catherine's Catholic Church, who found it tucked beneath the front door of the church rectory. Father O'Brien had known the Hartley family for years. Patricia taught Sunday school, and all three children had been baptized at St. Catherine's. The discovery of Emma's photograph at his church door felt like a personal violation of everything he considered sacred. The third photograph showed Emma in what appeared to be a different location, though still bound and clearly distressed. The background was different concrete blocks instead of wood paneling, suggesting she had been moved, but the most significant detail was barely visible in the lower right corner of the image. What appeared to be part of a license plate, though only a few letters and numbers were legible. Detective Reeves in Harrisburg immediately began working to enhance the license plate fragment, while investigators in Millfield focused on the pattern that was emerging from the photograph locations. The park, the bank, and the church formed a rough triangle that encompassed most of Millfield's central area. Each location was highly visible and symbolically significant: recreation, commerce, and faith. The message seemed clear. Nowhere in Millfield was safe from whoever was holding Emma. The community's response to the ongoing crisis had evolved from concern to fear to something approaching panic. Parents were no longer allowing their children outside unsupervised, and many families had sent their youngsters to stay with relatives in other towns until the situation was resolved. Local businesses reported decreased foot traffic as people avoided unnecessary trips into public areas. The summer activities that normally defined life in Millfield, outdoor concerts, farmers markets, community picnics, had been cancelled or postponed indefinitely. Jenny Morrison, meanwhile, had become virtually catatonic with guilt and fear. Despite reassurances from investigators, family members, and counselors, she remained convinced that Emma's fate was somehow her fault. If she had been braver, if she had insisted they stay together, if she had gone for help sooner, the list of self-recriminations was endless and heartbreaking. Her parents had sought professional help, but 12-year-old Jenny seemed unreachable, lost in a maze of trauma and survivor's guilt that would take years to navigate. The investigation itself had begun to strain the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI had assigned 6 agents to the case. The state police had dedicated a full investigation team, and Sheriff Kowalski's department was working around the clock. But despite their combined efforts, they seemed to be reacting to their suspects' moves rather than anticipating them. On July 23rd, 8 days after Emma's disappearance, the case took a dramatic turn that no one had anticipated. Roger Henley, a mechanic who operated a small garage on the outskirts of Millfield, contacted the sheriff's department with information that he had been reluctant to share. 3 days earlier, a man had brought a van to Henley's garage for emergency repairs, claiming to have engine trouble while passing through the area. The man had paid in cash, given a false name, and been extremely nervous throughout the interaction. What had initially struck Henley as merely odd behavior had taken on sinister significance as he followed news of the investigation. The van's interior had been modified in unusual ways. The rear windows were covered with what appeared to be newspaper, and the back area had been fitted with anchoring points that could have been used to secure cargo, or, Henley now realized with growing horror, restrain a person. More significantly, Henley had noticed Polaroid photographs scattered on the van's dashboard, not the official evidence photographs that had appeared in the media, but others that showed what appeared to be the same young girl in different positions and locations. Henley had completed the repairs and accepted payment without asking questions, but he had managed to note part of the van's license plate number before the vehicle left his garage. His description of the driver was frustratingly vague: average height, medium build, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. But it was the first direct witness account investigators had received. Agent Walsh immediately initiated a multi-state search for vehicles matching the van's description and partial license plate. Within hours, they had a match: a 1978 Chevrolet van registered to Leonard Thorne, age 47, with an address in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, approximately 60 miles from Millfield. A background check on Thorne revealed a criminal history that made every investigator's blood run cold. He had been arrested twice in the 1970s on charges related to child endangerment. Though both cases had been dismissed on technical grounds, he had no fixed employment and had moved frequently throughout central Pennsylvania. Most disturbing of all, he had been reported missing by his landlord 3 weeks earlier, after failing to pay rent and apparently abandoning his apartment. The search for Leonard Thorne became an immediate priority, with his photograph distributed to law enforcement agencies across the region. But even as the investigation seemed to be gaining focus, new questions emerged that complicated the emerging narrative. Analysis of the partial license plate visible in the third photograph revealed numbers and letters that didn't match Thorne's van, suggesting either that multiple vehicles were involved or that the perpetrator was using stolen or altered plates. The timeline also created problems. Witness accounts placed Emma's disappearance at approximately 12:40 on July 15th, but Henley's encounter with Thorne had occurred on July 20th, 5 days later. Was Thorne working with accomplices? Had Emma been held in one location and then moved to another? Or were investigators dealing with an even more complex situation than anyone had imagined? The fourth photograph appeared on July 25th, 10 days after Emma's disappearance, and it shattered every assumption investigators had made about the case. The image was discovered by Principal Harrison at Millfield Elementary School, who found it taped to the inside of his office window when he arrived for work that Tuesday morning. But this photograph was different from its predecessors in ways that left investigators struggling to understand what they were seeing. The image showed Emma, but she was no longer bound. She appeared to be sitting in what looked like a comfortable chair, and while she still seemed frightened and disoriented, she was not obviously restrained. Even more puzzling, the background showed what appeared to be a normal domestic interior wallpaper, family photographs on a mantel, and what might have been a television or radio. The most shocking detail was barely visible in the background: the partial profile of what appeared to be an elderly woman, sitting in another chair and apparently reading a book or magazine. The psychological profile that FBI analysts had constructed for Emma's captor was based on the assumption of a single perpetrator, acting alone and holding Emma in isolation. The presence of what appeared to be an elderly woman in a domestic setting challenged every element of that profile. Agent Walsh convened an emergency meeting of the investigation team to reassess their approach to the case. Were they dealing with a kidnapping ring? Was Emma being held by a family or group rather than an individual? Had she somehow been taken in by people who didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening? The domestic setting visible in the fourth photograph was also troubling for another reason. It suggested that Emma was being held in a location that appeared normal, even comfortable, rather than the isolated, threatening environment that the earlier photographs had implied. If Emma was in someone's home, Possibly with their knowledge and consent, the investigation faced an entirely different set of challenges. Detective Reeves in Harrisburg worked frantically to enhance every detail visible in the fourth photograph. The furniture, wallpaper patterns, and visible household items were analyzed for anything that might provide location clues. The elderly woman's partial profile was examined for distinctive features that might allow identification. But it was a detail that almost everyone missed that would prove to be the most significant discovery of all. In the extreme lower left corner of the fourth photograph, nearly obscured by shadow, was what appeared to be part of a floor tile or linoleum pattern. The design was distinctive, a geometric pattern in colors that suggested it was probably installed during the 1960s or early 1970s. More importantly, Detective Reeves was able to identify the specific manufacturer and style: Armstrong flooring, pattern 4372, colonial brick, discontinued. Armed with this information, investigators began a systematic canvass of homes in the Millfield area that might have been built or renovated during the relevant time period. The search was complicated by the fact that many homes had been updated since the 1970s, but older residents often remembered distinctive features of their neighbors' houses, and some homeowners had never bothered to replace original flooring in basements or back rooms. The canvass was painstaking work, but on July 28th, it produced results that no one had expected. Eleanor Vasquez, an elderly widow who lived alone in a small house on Pine Street, just 6 blocks from the Hartley family home, became agitated when investigators described the flooring pattern they were seeking. She confirmed that her basement had the exact flooring described, installed when the house was built in 1968. But what made her agitated wasn't the investigators' questions, it was the realization that someone else had been asking about the same thing. 3 weeks earlier, a man claiming to be from a flooring company had knocked on her door, asking permission to photograph her basement floor as an example of vintage installation work for a restoration project. Miss Vasquez, who was lonely and enjoyed having visitors, had welcomed the man into her home and given him a complete tour, including the basement. The man had been very interested in the basement, asking detailed questions about who had access to the house and when Mrs. Vasquez typically left for her daily errands. He had taken numerous photographs, including some that showed Mrs. Vasquez sitting in her favorite chair in the living room. Mrs. Vasquez's description of her visitor matched the general description that Roger Henley had provided of the man who had brought the van to his garage. Average height, medium build, baseball cap, and sunglasses. But Miss Vasquez had observed additional details. The man had spoken with what she described as a cultured accent, suggesting education, and his hands were clean and soft, not the hands of someone who worked with tools or machinery. Agent Walsh immediately ordered surveillance of Mrs. Vasquez's house, but he was already beginning to suspect that they were too late. If Emma had been held in the basement of a house 6 blocks from her own home, and if her captor had been methodical enough to scout the location weeks in advance, then the investigation was dealing with someone far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The 5th and final photograph was discovered on July 30th, 15 days after Emma's disappearance, and it contained a message that chilled every investigator who saw it. This time, the photograph had been left on the Hartley family's own front porch, tucked beneath their morning newspaper. Patricia Hartley found it when she stepped outside to collect the mail, and her scream brought neighbors running from 3 houses away. The image showed Emma sitting at what appeared to be a kitchen table, with a plate of food in front of her, and what might have been a glass of milk. She appeared healthier than in previous photographs. Her hair had been combed, her clothing was clean, and while she still looked frightened, she no longer showed obvious signs of physical distress. But written across the bottom of the photograph in neat, careful handwriting was a message that made Agent Walsh's blood run cold. "She's fine. Don't worry. She's going to have a wonderful new life." The psychological implications of the message were staggering. Emma's captor was no longer simply documenting her captivity. They were announcing their intention to keep her permanently. The reference to a wonderful new life suggested a delusional belief that what was happening to Emma was somehow beneficial to her. The handwriting analysis revealed additional disturbing details. The script was precise and controlled, suggesting someone with above-average education and possibly professional or clerical experience. The ink appeared to be from a fountain pen, an unusual choice that might provide additional clues about the perpetrator's background or preferences. Most troubling of all, the domestic setting visible in the final photograph appeared to be different from the location shown in the fourth image. Emma had been moved again, this time to what looked like a more modern kitchen, with newer appliances and different wallpaper patterns. Agent Walsh realized that the investigation was facing a nightmare scenario. Emma was being held by someone who had access to multiple locations, who was sophisticated enough to plan and execute a complex kidnapping, and who apparently believed they were rescuing Emma rather than harming her. The case had evolved far beyond a simple abduction. They were dealing with someone who had spent weeks or possibly months planning Emma's disappearance, who had scouted multiple locations, and who was documenting their actions with the systematic precision of someone who believed they were creating a record of something positive and meaningful. As July turned to August, and Emma entered her third week in captivity, investigators faced the grim reality that their suspect had successfully evaded detection, despite leaving a trail of photographic evidence. The very boldness that should have made them easier to catch had instead demonstrated a level of planning and execution that left law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania struggling to understand who they were hunting and where Emma might be. In the sweltering heat of August 1988, while searchers continued their methodical canvass of central Pennsylvania, Emma Hartley remained somewhere in the shadows alive, according to the photographs, but held by someone whose motivations and ultimate intentions remained as mysterious as they were terrifying. The fifth photograph, with its chilling message about Emma's wonderful new life, suggested that time was not on the investigation's side. Whoever was holding Emma believed they were doing something good for her, and people who believed they were saving someone were capable of actions that rational individuals could never anticipate or understand. As Agent Walsh stared at the final photograph, one question haunted him above all others. If Emma's captor truly believed they were giving her a better life, what would it take to convince them to let her go home? The breakthrough that would ultimately solve the case of Emma Hartley's disappearance came from an unexpected source, a 73-year-old retired postal worker named Harold Givens, whose obsessive attention to detail had made him both an exemplary employee and an exhausting neighbor for more than 40 years. Givens lived alone in a meticulously maintained house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the Hartley family home, where he had spent his retirement years documenting what he considered to be the declining standards of his neighborhood. He maintained detailed logs of unusual vehicles, unfamiliar visitors, and any deviation from what he considered normal residential patterns. His neighbors had long since learned to avoid him during his daily inspection walks, but his compulsive record-keeping was about to prove invaluable to investigators. On August 2nd, after seeing news coverage that included photographs of Leonard Thorne's van and appeals for information about suspicious vehicles, Givens contacted the sheriff's department with information that would transform the investigation. According to his meticulously maintained logs, he had observed unusual activity at a house on his street for several weeks prior to Emma's disappearance, activity that had intensified significantly in the days following July 5th. The house in question was 247 Elm Street, a modest 2-story colonial that belonged to Dorothy Newman, a 68-year-old retired school librarian who had lived there alone since her husband's death in 1985. Mrs. Newman was well regarded in the community, known for her volunteer work at St. Catherine's Church and her tendency to take in stray animals. She had taught at Millfield Elementary for 35 years, and several generations of local children remembered her as a kind, if somewhat eccentric presence in their academic lives. According to Givens's logs, Mrs. Newman had begun receiving regular visits from an unfamiliar man in mid-June, approximately 1 month before Emma's disappearance. The visits typically occurred in the evening hours, and the visitor drove different vehicles on different occasions, sometimes a sedan, sometimes a pickup truck, and on at least 3 occasions, a van that matched the description investigators had been circulating. More significantly, Givens had noticed that Mrs. Newman's daily routines had changed dramatically after July 15th. Prior to that date, she had maintained regular patterns: morning walks, afternoon grocery shopping, evening gardening. After Emma's disappearance, Mrs. Newman had largely stopped leaving her house, and when she did venture outside, her behavior seemed nervous and distracted. Agent Walsh immediately ordered surveillance of the Newman house while investigators began a discreet background check on Dorothy Newman herself. What they discovered challenged every assumption they had made about the case. Mrs. Newman's employment records at Millfield Elementary revealed that she had been the subject of several complaints during her final years of teaching, though none had resulted in formal disciplinary action. Parents had reported that she seemed overly attached to certain students, particularly those from troubled home situations. She had been known to provide food, clothing, and sometimes overnight shelter to children she believed were being neglected or mistreated at home. More troubling, Mrs. Newman had never married her supposed husband. Harold Newman had been a long-time boarder in her home, who had helped maintain the fiction of marriage for social convenience. When Harold died in 1985, he left behind boxes of photography equipment and a basement darkroom that Mrs. Newman had maintained but never used. The picture that was emerging was of a lonely, emotionally disturbed woman who had spent decades working with children and who had become increasingly convinced that she could provide better care than many of the parents she observed. Her access to school records would have given her detailed information about students' home situations, and her position as a trusted community member would have allowed her to move through Millfield without suspicion. But Mrs. Newman was 68 years old, physically frail, and had no history of violence or criminal behavior. The idea that she could have overpowered and abducted a healthy 12-year-old seemed unlikely, which meant she was probably working with someone else, the mysterious male visitor that Harold Givens had been documenting. On August 4th, investigators made the decision to approach Dorothy Newman directly. Agent Walsh, accompanied by Sheriff Kowalski and a female state police detective, knocked on the front door of 2nd Elm Street at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, hoping to catch Miss Newman during what Givens's logs indicated was one of her few predictable routines. Mrs. Newman answered the door wearing a faded house dress and slippers, her gray hair uncombed and her eyes showing the kind of confusion that might indicate either guilt or genuine bewilderment. When Agent Walsh identified himself and requested permission to speak with her about Emma Hartley's disappearance, Mrs. Newman's reaction was immediate and devastating. She began to cry, not the careful tears of someone attempting deception, but the uncontrolled sobbing of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. Between gasps and stammered words, she repeated a single phrase over and over. "I was trying to help her. I was only trying to help her." Agent Walsh immediately read Mrs. Newman her rights while Sheriff Kowalski radioed for backup and medical personnel. But before anyone could ask direct questions about Emma's whereabouts, Mrs. Newman volunteered information that made every investigator's blood run cold. "She's not here anymore," Mrs. Newman whispered through her tears. "Thomas took her away. He said it wasn't safe here anymore, with all the police cars and questions. He said he knew a place where she could be happy." The mysterious male visitor had a name, Thomas, and he had apparently removed Emma from Mrs. Newman's house sometime in the previous few days. When investigators pressed for more information about Thomas's identity and whereabouts, Mrs. Newman's responses became increasingly incoherent. She seemed to believe that Thomas was her nephew, though she had no living relatives. She insisted that he was a teacher who specialized in helping difficult children, though she couldn't provide any details about where he worked or lived. A search of the Newman house, conducted with Mrs. Newman's consent, revealed a basement room that had clearly been occupied recently. The room contained a bed with children's sheets, toys that appeared to be appropriate for a 12-year-old, and a small table set with dishes and silverware. Most significantly, investigators found several Polaroid photographs scattered on a dresser, images of Emma that had never been left for public discovery. These private photographs showed a progression that was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. The earliest images showed Emma terrified and resistant, but later photographs revealed a gradual change in her demeanor. She appeared to be responding to her captors, eating meals, playing with toys, and eventually even smiling tentatively at the camera. The transformation suggested a complex psychological manipulation that had taken place over the course of her captivity. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a notebook found in the basement room, filled with Mrs. Newman's careful handwriting. The entries, written in the style of a teacher's daily log, documented Emma's progress during her time in the house. Miss Newman had recorded Emma's eating habits, her emotional state, and her responses to various educational activities that had been designed to help her adjust to her new life. The notebook entries revealed that Mrs. Newman genuinely believed she was rescuing Emma from what she perceived as neglectful parents. She had convinced herself that the Hartley family didn't appreciate Emma's intelligence and curiosity, and that Emma would be better served by caregivers who understood her special needs. The delusion was complete and apparently unshakable, but the notebook also contained references to Thomas that provided investigators with their first concrete leads about Emma's current whereabouts. Miss Newman had written about Thomas's expertise in helping children transition to better situations, and she had noted several conversations about locations where Emma might be permanently settled with understanding families. Agent Walsh immediately initiated a multi-state search for any individual named Thomas who might have connections to child welfare, education, or adoption services. The search was complicated by the fact that Mrs. Newman's mental state made her an unreliable source of information, but investigators were now certain they were dealing with an organized network rather than a single disturbed individual. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Detective Reeves in Harrisburg, still working to analyze every detail from the Polaroid photographs, had been focusing on background elements that might provide location clues. In one of the photographs found in Mrs. Newman's basement, she had identified a partial reflection in a window that showed what appeared to be a commercial sign. Using computer enhancement techniques that were cutting edge for 1988, Reeves was able to make out partial lettering that appeared to read Isle Drens. The obvious interpretation was children's home, suggesting that Emma had been photographed in proximity to some kind of residential facility for minors. A search of state records revealed 17 licensed children's homes within a 200-mile radius of Millfield. Investigators began systematically contacting each facility, looking for any connection to someone named Thomas or any unusual activity during the period of Emma's captivity. On August 7th, they found what they were looking for: the Clearfield County Children's Home, located approximately 60 miles northeast of Millfield, reported that they had recently dismissed an employee named Thomas Brenner for inappropriate behavior with the children in their care. Brenner had worked as a counselor at the facility for 3 years, and he had been terminated in early July after other staff members reported that he had been taking unauthorized photographs of residents and making inappropriate comments about saving certain children from their situations. Thomas Brenner was 34 years old, unmarried, and had no permanent address. His employment history showed a pattern of jobs at various childcare facilities throughout Pennsylvania, with several unexplained gaps and at least 2 previous terminations for boundary violations. Most significantly, his personnel file included a note that he had been reported to authorities in 1986 for attempting to remove a child from a foster home without authorization, though charges had never been filed. The personnel file also contained a recent address, a rural property near the town of Diaries, Pennsylvania, that Brenner had listed as his residence when he was hired at the children's home. Local authorities were immediately contacted, and a coordinated raid was planned for the following morning. But Thomas Brenner had anticipated the investigation's progress. When officers arrived at the Dubois property on August 8th, they found an abandoned farmhouse with clear evidence of recent occupation, but no sign of either Brenner or Emma. The house contained more children's clothing and toys, suggesting that Emma had been held there, but it also contained evidence that suggested this was not Brenner's first victim. In a bedroom on the second floor, investigators found a collection of photograph albums that documented what appeared to be years of activity similar to Emma's case. The albums contained hundreds of Polaroid photographs showing different children in various locations, all appearing to be held against their will but gradually adapting to their situations. The children ranged in age from approximately 8 to 15, and the photographs spanned what appeared to be a period of several years. Each album was carefully organized and labeled, with handwritten notes that provided dates, locations, and observations about each child's progress. The notes revealed that Brenner had a systematic approach to selecting and grooming his victims, typically targeting children from troubled families or institutional settings where their disappearances might not be immediately noticed or vigorously investigated. The albums also contained correspondence between Brenner and various collaborators, including Dorothy Newman. The letters revealed that Brenner had been cultivating relationships with lonely, mentally unstable adults who could be convinced to participate in what he portrayed as rescue operations for endangered children. Miss Newman was apparently not his only accomplice. The correspondence referenced several other individuals in different states who had provided temporary housing for abducted children. Most disturbing of all, the albums contained evidence that several of Brenner's previous victims had ultimately been sold or transferred to third parties. The later photographs in some sequences showed children being prepared for what the notes described as permanent placement, with special families who would understand their needs. The realization that they were dealing with an interstate trafficking operation, rather than a simple kidnapping, transformed the investigation into a federal priority. FBI resources from multiple field offices were mobilized, and a task force was assembled to coordinate the search for both Brenner and his current and former victims. But for the Hartley family and the community of Millfield, the revelation that Emma had been held for weeks just blocks from her own home, by someone they had known and trusted for decades, was almost impossible to process. The knowledge that Dorothy Newman had watched Emma ride past her house hundreds of times, had taught her in school, and had apparently spent months planning her abduction, challenged every assumption about safety and trust that had defined life in their small town. The search for Thomas Brenner and Emma continued for another 3 weeks, with reported sightings and false leads stretching across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Brenner had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to evade detection, and his network of accomplices and safe houses appeared to be far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The case reached its tragic conclusion on August 29th, 45 days after Emma's initial disappearance. Pennsylvania State Police received a report of a single-car accident on a remote mountain road near the town of Bradford, in the northwestern corner of the state. The vehicle, a stolen pickup truck, had apparently left the road during a rainstorm and struck a large tree. The driver, who matched the description of Thomas Brenner, had been killed instantly. In the back of the truck, wrapped in blankets and apparently placed there with care, investigators found the body of Emma Hartley. The medical examiner's report would later determine that Emma had died approximately 1 week before the accident, from what appeared to be complications related to an untreated illness, possibly pneumonia or a similar respiratory infection. There was no evidence of physical trauma beyond what was consistent with inadequate medical care, suggesting that Brenner had not deliberately harmed her, but had failed to provide proper treatment when she became sick. The final irony of Emma's death was that Brenner, who had convinced himself and his accomplices that he was rescuing children from neglectful families, had ultimately killed her through the same kind of neglect he claimed to be fighting against. The investigation into Brenner's network continued for months after his death, eventually leading to arrests in 4 states and the recovery of 6 other children who had been reported missing over a period of several years. Dorothy Newman was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a state psychiatric facility where she would spend the remainder of her life insisting that she had been trying to help the children in her care. Emma Hartley was buried in Millfield Cemetery on September 3, 1988, in a service attended by more than 800 people from throughout central Pennsylvania. The little girl who had vanished during a summer bicycle ride had become a symbol of innocence lost and trust betrayed, her death marking the end of an era when parents in small towns could assume their children were safe simply because they lived in a place where everyone knew everyone else. The psychological scars left by Emma's disappearance and death would linger in Millfield for generations. Jenny Morrison, who had survived the Creek expedition that claimed her best friend's life, would struggle with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress for years. She eventually became a social worker, specializing in missing children cases, dedicating her professional life helping other families navigate the kind of tragedy that had destroyed her own childhood innocence. Robert and Patricia Hartley never fully recovered from their daughter's death. Their marriage, strained beyond repair by grief and guilt, ended in divorce. Patricia moved to Florida, where she taught at a private school until her retirement, while Robert remained in Millfield, but never spoke publicly about Emma's case again. Both parents died within 6 months of each other in 2019, their obituaries noting that they were survived by their son Danny and daughter Claire, but making no mention of the daughter whose memory had haunted their family for more than 30 years. The community of Millfield itself changed in ways both subtle and profound. Parents began supervising their children more closely, and the casual freedom that had once defined childhood in small-town America was replaced by a cautious awareness of potential dangers. The local elementary school implemented new security procedures, and several families moved away rather than continue living in a place associated with such tragedy. Perhaps most significantly, the case of Emma Hartley led to changes in how law enforcement agencies handled missing children cases. The systematic documentation that Thomas Brenner had maintained, and the network of accomplices he had cultivated, revealed that child trafficking was far more organized and widespread than anyone had previously understood. New protocols were developed for interstate cooperation, and specialized task forces were established to investigate cases that showed evidence of organized criminal networks. The Polaroid photographs that had provided the initial breaks in Emma's case were eventually destroyed, but not before they had been studied by behavioral analysts and criminal psychologists who used them to develop profiles of similar offenders. The case became a textbook example of how predators could exploit community trust and institutional authority to gain access to victims. Today, more than 3 decades after Emma's disappearance, Millfield remains a small, quiet town in central Pennsylvania. The house on Elm Street, where Dorothy Newman lived, is now occupied by a young family with no knowledge of its dark history. The creek where Emma was last seen alive has been developed into a small park with walking trails and picnic tables, but older residents still avoid the area, particularly during the summer months. The Hartley house on Maple Street has changed hands several times since the family's departure, but local real estate agents still sometimes struggle to find buyers willing to live in a home associated with such tragedy. The red Schwinn bicycle that Emma had ridden to Miller's Creek was never recovered, though residents occasionally reported seeing a child's bicycle abandoned in various locations around town, sightings that always proved to be false alarms, but which served as persistent reminders of the summer when innocents died in Millfield. The case file for Emma Hartley's disappearance and death remains open, not because there are unresolved questions about her fate, but because investigators continue to discover connections between Thomas Brenner's network and other missing children cases from the 1980s. Every few years, a new piece of evidence surfaces: a photograph, a letter, a witness account that adds another layer to the understanding of how extensive and organized the trafficking operation had become. In the end, Emma Hartley's legacy is not the tragedy of her death, but the awareness her case created about the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of communities to protect their most precious members. Her story serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces and trusted institutions, and that the price of innocence is eternal vigilance. The summer of 1988 in Millfield, Pennsylvania began with the simple pleasure of a 12-year-old girl riding her bicycle toward adventure and ended with the recognition that no place is truly safe, no person entirely trustworthy, and no child immune from the darkness that exists at the margins of even the most peaceful community. Emma's photograph, the one taken for the school yearbook just months before her disappearance, still appears occasionally in news articles about missing children or in training materials for law enforcement officers. In that image, she is smiling, her green eyes bright with the kind of optimism that believes the world is fundamentally good and that tomorrow will always bring new possibilities for joy and discovery. That photograph stands as both a memorial to a life cut tragically short and a challenge to every adult who sees it, to be worthy of the trust that children place in us, to remain vigilant against those who would exploit that trust, and to never forget that the most precious thing any community possesses is not its landmarks or traditions, but the laughter of its children and the promise of their futures. The case of Emma Hartley's disappearance officially closed with Thomas Brenner's death on that rainy mountain road in August. But for those who lived through those terrible summer weeks, the questions linger still. How many other Dorothy Newmans are there, lonely and confused and susceptible to manipulation? How many other Thomas Brenners are out there, presenting themselves as helpers while pursuing their own dark purposes? And how do we protect our children without destroying the very innocence we seek to preserve? These questions have no easy answers, which is perhaps the most haunting legacy of all. In a world where a trusted school librarian can become an accomplice to kidnapping, and where a man who claimed to save children actually destroyed them, the only certainty is that vigilance is the price of safety, and that price must be paid by every generation, in every community, for as long as children need protection from the darkness that walks among us.